I didn't notice the change the day it started. That's the strange part. If you had asked me back then when exactly my son stopped asking how I was doing, I wouldn't have known what to tell you. There wasn't a moment. There wasn't a conversation. There wasn't even a silence that felt unusual at first. It was something softer than that. Something that slipped quietly between ordinary days. I'd only realized it later, when I found myself answering questions he hadn't asked anymore. For most of my life, my son Daniel used to begin every call the same way. "How are you doing, Dad?" Not quickly. Not out of habit. He used to wait for the answer. And I always had one. Sometimes it was about work. Sometimes about the house. Sometimes about the garden out back that never quite grew the way I expected it to. Sometimes it was about nothing important at all. But he listened anyway. I didn't know then how much a simple question like that could mean. You don't notice those things when they're still part of your life. You only notice when they disappear. Daniel was born on a rainy Thursday afternoon in late October. I remember the weather clearly because I stood outside the hospital entrance for a few minutes before going in, just watching the rain fall on the pavement. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I needed a moment before everything changed. Because I knew it would. He was our first child. I had never held someone that small before. I had never been responsible for someone who depended on me in that quiet, complete way. When the nurse placed him in my arms, he didn't cry. He just looked around like he was already trying to understand where he had arrived. He had his mother's eyes. That's what I remember thinking first. And then I remember thinking something else, something I never said out loud to anyone at the time. I thought, I hope I do this right. When Daniel was little, he followed me everywhere. Not in a loud way. Not in the way some children do. He just liked being nearby. If I was fixing something in the garage, he sat on the step and watched. If I was mowing the lawn, he walked behind me pushing a plastic toy mower that didn't cut anything but made him feel useful. If I was reading the newspaper at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, he climbed onto the chair beside me and asked questions about words he didn't understand yet. He asked a lot of questions. Sometimes about things I knew. Sometimes about things I didn't. But he always assumed I would try to answer anyway. And I always did. Saturday mornings used to belong to us. That was our routine. His mother worked early shifts back then, so the house stayed quiet in a different way on Saturdays. Daniel and I would sit at the kitchen table eating toast with too much butter and drinking orange juice that always tasted a little colder than it should have. Then we would decide what the day was going to be. Sometimes we went to the hardware store even when we didn't need anything. Sometimes we worked in the yard. Sometimes we just drove around without much of a plan. He liked riding in the truck with the window halfway open. Even in cooler weather. He used to ask questions about everything we passed. "What's that building? Why is that road closed? Where does that train go?" I didn't always know the answers. But he never seemed disappointed when I said that. He just liked asking. When he got older, the questions changed. They became quieter. More thoughtful. Less about the world and more about himself. I remember the first time he asked me if I had ever been afraid of failing at something important. We were sitting in the garage that evening. He was about 16. Old enough to pretend he didn't need advice. Young enough to still want it. I told him the truth. I told him I had been afraid many times. He didn't say anything after that for a while. But he stayed sitting there longer than usual. And before he went inside, he said something I still remember clearly. "I'm glad I can ask you things." That sentence stayed with me for years. Maybe longer than he ever expected it would. When he left for college, the house became quieter in a way I wasn't prepared for. Not empty. Just different. His room stayed the same for a long time after that. His mother didn't want to change anything. I think she believed he might walk back in one afternoon and need everything exactly where he left it. I understood that feeling. I didn't say it out loud either. He called often during those first months away. More than I expected, honestly. Sometimes late at night. Sometimes between classes. sometimes just to say he had found a new cafe he liked or a professor who reminded him of someone from home. And every time he called, he asked the same question. "How are you doing, Dad?" I always answered. Sometimes too much. Sometimes too little. But I answered. Years passed the way they always do. Not slowly. Not quickly. Just steadily. He graduated. Found work. Moved to another city. Built a life that didn't include our street or our neighborhood or our Saturday morning routines anymore. That was normal. That was the way things were supposed to happen. Children grow up. They move forward. Parents stay where they are. Or at least that's how it feels. When he married Laura, I remember standing beside him at the reception watching him talk with people I didn't know yet but who already knew him well. He looked comfortable in a way I hadn't seen before. Confident. Certain. Like someone who had stepped fully into his own life. I was proud of him that day. Very proud. And later that night, when everyone else had gone home and the hall was nearly empty, he came over and sat beside me for a moment. "How are you doing, Dad?" he asked. The same question. The same voice. Just a little older. I told him I was doing fine. And I meant it. For many years after that, he still called regularly. Not as often as before. But enough that the connection between us never felt fragile. We talked about work. About repairs around the house. About his plans. About small things that didn't matter but somehow always did. He asked about my back when it started bothering me. He asked about the garden when the tomatoes finally grew properly one summer. He asked about his mother after she got sick that winter. He always asked. That's what I remember most clearly now. Not the length of the conversations. Not even what we talked about. Just the fact that he asked. The first time I noticed something had changed, it didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a busy evening. He called while I was washing dishes. I dried my hands on a towel before answering. We talked about his work. About a repair he needed help thinking through. About something his neighbor had said that bothered him more than he expected. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes. It felt normal. Comfortable. Familiar. And after we hung up, I went back to the sink and finished drying the last plate. Only later that night, when I was sitting in the living room with the television on low, I realized something I couldn't quite explain at first. He hadn't asked how I was doing. Not once. I told myself I was imagining it. People forget things sometimes. Conversations move quickly. Life gets busy. It didn't mean anything. But a few days later, when he called again, I noticed something else. He still sounded like himself. He still told me about his week. He still asked for advice about something small. He still laughed in the same way he always had. But again, he didn't ask. And this time I noticed it before the call ended. I waited a few seconds after we said goodbye, still holding the phone in my hand. As if maybe the question would arrive late. It didn't. I told myself it wasn't important. I told myself I was reading too much into something small. But later that evening, as I walked past the hallway where his childhood photos still hang on the wall and the same wooden frames we bought years ago, I slowed down without meaning to. And for the first time in a long while, I found myself wondering when he had stopped asking. After that evening, I tried not to think about it too much. There are some thoughts that feel too small to take seriously and too heavy to ignore at the same time. This was one of them. At first, I told myself it was just coincidence. Daniel had always been busy. Even as a boy, he liked to keep his mind full of plans. When he was younger, that meant building things in the garage with me or taking apart old radios just to see what was inside. As an adult, it meant work deadlines, meetings, responsibilities I didn't fully understand anymore. Life becomes crowded in ways parents don't always see from the outside. So I told myself that was all it was. Just life. Still, the next time he called, I noticed something before I even answered the phone. I noticed I was waiting. Not waiting for the call itself. waiting for the question. "How are you doing, Dad?" It used to come so naturally that I never thought about it. Now I was listening for it the way people listen for the sound of a familiar train that no longer passes through town. He called on a Tuesday evening. I remember because Tuesday was always laundry day in our house for as long as I can remember. Even after my wife passed, I kept the routine the same. Some habits stay with you longer than the people who started them. I answered the phone while folding shirts at the kitchen table. He sounded cheerful. He told me about something his manager had said at work. He told me about a trip he and Laura were planning for the fall. He even asked whether I still had the old toolbox from the garage because he was thinking about fixing something in their basement. We talked for almost 20 minutes. It was a good conversation. Comfortable. Familiar. And again, he didn't ask. When we finished talking, I sat there for a while with one of his old shirts in my hands. It wasn't really his anymore. He had left it years ago, and somehow it had stayed folded in the back of the closet all this time. I still used it sometimes when working outside. I realized then that I had answered a question he never asked. Halfway through the call I had said, "I'm doing all right here." He hadn't asked? But I answered anyway. That was the first time I understood something was changing. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. Just quietly. Like a door closing in another room. After that, I began noticing other small things. Not immediately. Gradually. He still called. But the calls started sounding different. Shorter sometimes. More focused. Less wandering. When Daniel was younger, our conversations used to drift from one subject to another without any real plan. We would start talking about something simple, like a leaky faucet, and end up discussing a memory from 10 years earlier. Now the conversations had direction. Purpose. They began somewhere and ended somewhere else without stopping in between. And most of the time, they ended when whatever he needed to talk about had been settled. At first I didn't think anything of that either. That's how adult lives work. People call when they have something to say. Still, one evening I noticed something that stayed with me longer than the rest. He called while I was outside trimming the hedge near the driveway. I could hear the phone ringing through the open kitchen window. I walked inside, wiped my hands on a towel, and answered. He sounded slightly rushed. Not worried. Just busy. He asked if I still remembered the plumber we used years ago when the pipes froze in winter. He needed a recommendation because something in his house had started leaking. We talked about it for a few minutes. I gave him the number. He thanked me. And then there was a pause. Not an uncomfortable pause. Just a small space where something used to happen. A space where a question used to live. I waited. He didn't ask. Instead, he said, "All right, Dad, I should let you go." I said goodbye. And after I hung up, I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to. The hedge outside still needed trimming. The clippers were still leaning against the fence. But I didn't go back outside right away. Instead, I looked at the calendar on the wall. It was something I had started doing more often lately. Checking the calendar. Not because I had somewhere to go. Just because it helped me keep track of days in a way that felt steady. Daniel used to ask about my schedule sometimes. "Got anything planned this week? Doing anything interesting today?" Small questions like that. They weren't important. But they made the day feel shared. Now the calendar stayed mostly quiet. The next time I saw him in person was at his house. Laura had invited me over for dinner. She always did that. She never forgot. I appreciated that about her. Their house was larger than ours had ever been. Newer, too. It still smelled like fresh paint in some of the rooms even after all those years. Daniel met me at the door. He hugged me the same way he always had. Nothing about that felt different. We sat at the table together later that evening. Laura talked about work. Daniel talked about the repairs he had been doing in the basement. I listened. I asked questions. I told them about the tomatoes finally growing properly again this year. Daniel smiled when I said that. He always liked hearing about the garden. But he didn't ask anything else about how things were at home. He didn't ask whether I was managing all right with the house. He didn't ask whether I still drove into town as often as before. He didn't ask whether the evenings felt longer now. Of course, he couldn't have known those were the things I might have said. Still, something felt different sitting there at that table. Not wrong. Just quieter. Later that evening, after dinner, I helped him carry a few empty boxes down to the basement. It reminded me of when he was younger. We used to carry things together all the time. Wood. Tools. Groceries. Christmas decorations. There is something simple and steady about carrying things side by side. Halfway down the stairs he said, "Thanks for coming, Dad." It was a normal sentence. But the way he said it sounded different. Like he was thanking a guest. Not a father. I don't think he meant it that way. Still, I noticed. On the drive home that night, I turned the radio off earlier than usual. Sometimes silence helps you understand what you're feeling. Sometimes it just makes the feeling clearer. When I got home, the house was exactly the way I had left it. The lamp in the living room still glowed softly near the chair by the window. The hallway still held the same photographs. The kitchen still smelled faintly like coffee from that morning. Everything was the same. Except something wasn't. A few weeks later, Daniel called again. This time it was late in the evening. Later than usual. I answered right away. He sounded tired. Not upset. Just worn out in the way people sound when they've been carrying too many things for too long. He told me work had been difficult that week. He told me Laura had been busy too. He asked if I still had the ladder in the garage because he might need to borrow one soon. We talked for about 10 minutes. And again. He didn't ask how I was doing. I almost told him anyway. I almost said something simple like, "Things are quiet here." Or maybe, "I've been spending more time in the yard lately." But the words didn't come. Instead, I waited. And after we said goodbye, I stayed sitting at the kitchen table with the phone still in my hand. It wasn't disappointment I felt. Not exactly. It was something softer than that. Something harder to explain. It felt like I had stepped slightly outside the circle of his life without realizing when it happened. Like I was still there. Still close. Still important in some ways. But no longer at the center of his attention the way I used to be. That realization didn't arrive all at once. It arrived slowly. Quietly. And one evening, as I sat in the living room watching the light from the television move across the walls the same way it always had, I found myself wondering something I hadn't asked before. Not why he had stopped asking how I was, but whether he even realized he had stopped. For a long time after that, I didn't say anything to Daniel. Not because I didn't want to. And not because I didn't think about it. It was simply because I didn't know how to say something like that without making it sound heavier than it really was. There are some changes in life that don't belong in conversations right away. They belong in observation first. In quiet understanding. In patience. So I watched. Not in a suspicious way. Just the way a father watches. The way I always had. Winter arrived earlier than expected that year. The first cold morning came while I was still convinced there would be a few more warm days left. I stepped outside to pick up the newspaper and saw frost on the steps. Not thick frost. Just enough to remind me that the season had changed while I wasn't paying attention. That's how it felt with Daniel too. Not sudden. Just there. One afternoon a few weeks later, I found myself standing in the garage longer than usual. The workbench still looked the same as it had years ago. The old tools hung exactly where they always had. Even the small scratch on the corner of the wooden surface, where Daniel once dropped a wrench when he was 14, was still there. He had been nervous that day. He thought I would be upset. Instead, I remember laughing. "It's just wood," I told him. But he stayed quiet afterward. And before going inside he asked, "You're not mad?" "No," I said. "Not about things like that." He had nodded slowly, like he was trying to understand something bigger than the scratch itself. Standing there in the garage years later, I ran my hand across that same spot again. It felt smaller than I remembered. Or maybe my hands had changed. I realized then that I missed those kinds of questions from him. Not the important ones. Just the simple ones. The ones that meant he still needed to know what I thought. That evening I made dinner earlier than usual. Nothing special. Soup and bread. I set the bowl on the table and sat down in the same chair I had used for years. Across from me, the other chair stayed empty the way it usually did now. At some point during the meal, I picked up my phone without thinking. I didn't call him. I didn't even unlock the screen. I just held it for a moment. And then I set it back down again. That was when I understood something clearly for the first time. I wasn't waiting for him to ask how I was anymore. I was waiting to feel included in his life the way I used to be. And those are not the same thing. A few days later, Daniel called again. It was late afternoon. The light coming through the kitchen window made the room feel warmer than it actually was. He sounded relaxed. Not busy. Not rushed. Just comfortable. We talked about the weather first. Then about the garden. He even asked whether the apple tree near the fence was still producing fruit the way it used to. That surprised me. He hadn't mentioned the apple tree in years. For a moment, the conversation felt exactly the way it used to feel when he was younger. Easy. Unplanned. Familiar. And then there was that small pause again. The space where the question used to be. I almost filled it myself. I almost said something about the house feeling quieter lately. Or about how I had started walking in the evenings just to have somewhere to go before dark. But instead, I asked him something. "Are you doing all right?" I said. There was a short silence on the other end of the line. Not uncomfortable. Just thoughtful. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "Yeah, I think so." Then he added something he hadn't said in a long time. "I've been meaning to come by more often." He didn't say why he hadn't. And I didn't ask. Some explanations don't need words. A few weeks later, he did come by. Not for a repair. Not to borrow something. Not because Laura had invited me first. He just stopped by. It was a Saturday morning. I heard the car before I saw him. The sound of tires on the driveway still has a way of reaching me faster than any doorbell ever could. When I opened the door, he smiled the same way he always had. "Thought I'd come see how things are going," he said. That sentence stayed with me longer than he probably expected. Not because it was unusual, but because it had been a long time since I heard something like that from him. We sat at the kitchen table together for a while. We didn't talk about anything important. Just the usual things. The garden. The house. The neighbor's dog that kept digging under the fence again. At one point he looked around the kitchen quietly. The same way people do when they're remembering something without saying it out loud. Then he said something I didn't expect. "I used to sit right there," he said, pointing to the chair across from mine. "Yes," I said. "You did." He nodded. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he asked the question I hadn't heard in a long time. "How are you doing, Dad?" It sounded the same. Not forced. Not formal. Just familiar. I answered the way I always had. "I'm doing all right." And I meant it. Because something had changed again. Not back to the way things used to be. Life doesn't move backward like that. But forward in a different direction. A direction that felt steadier somehow. We talked for another hour after that. Before he left, he stood in the hallway for a moment looking at the old photographs on the wall. The same photographs he had walked past hundreds of times as a boy without really noticing them. "This place still feels the same," he said. "It is the same," I told him. He smiled. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it is." After he left, I didn't feel the quiet in the house the same way I had before. It wasn't emptiness. It was space. There's a difference between those two things. Space leaves room for people to return. Emptiness doesn't. Later that evening, As the light from the setting sun moved slowly across the living room floor, I sat in my chair near the window and thought about how easy it is to misunderstand distance. Sometimes distance doesn't mean someone has moved away from you. Sometimes it just means their life has grown larger. And sometimes the only thing that changes is the way you learn to stand beside it instead of inside it. Daniel didn't stop caring about me. He didn't forget me. He didn't leave me behind. He just became a man with a life of his own. And I became something different too. Not less important. Just different. And that evening, for the first time in a long while, I understood something I wish I had realized earlier. He didn't need to ask how I was every time he called. Because he already knew where I was. Right where I had always been. At home. Waiting, yes. But not alone. Still his father. And still part of his life, even in the quiet ways that don't always sound like questions anymore.